This is a program about our history in this area in Whitman and Hanson. Right now we're going through a very trying time with the COVID-19 outbreak that's going on, and we thought we'd go over a little history of epidemiology in the area just to show you that things aren't necessarily really strange. This is something that has happened continuously throughout history. And with me I have Historic Commission Chair Marie Layla from Whitman, who is also a retired nurse, and we're going to talk a little bit about the different epidemics that have hit this area and the things that were done to try and stop it and without letting it run its full course. Marie, where did you want to start on this?
Well, I guess I would like to start with the 1918 flu epidemic, only because it mimics so closely what we're experiencing now. It started in the springtime, 1918. The world is ready for World War I. It's already happening over in Europe. The United States has ganged up and said, okay, we're going to jump into the war effort. So out in Fort Riley, Kansas, some young kids that they had brought in from all over the United States got sick. It wasn't a big deal. It was fever, sore throat, headache, except for then 48 soldiers died. Of course, they don't want to tell anybody that because they don't want to see our weaknesses. So now we're sending all of these kids over to Europe. It was called the Spanish influenza, and it was called that because the Spanish weren't in the war, and they were the only ones reporting about it.
Yeah, there was a lot of news blackouts that were being done by the people who were actual participants in that war.
Exactly. And no one wanted to admit that maybe what we were doing was adding to it. You also need to remember that in 1918, we didn't know a lot about this. It was new. It was happening quickly to people. It was in the summer. They spread it all over Europe, all over the world. We were talking the other evening about 72 Indians from Alaska died out of a town of 80 people. So it was very scary.
You know, that's like an 80% mortality rate.
Exactly. And they didn't understand how it spread.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, there was one other place was Samoa, not American Samoa, but the other Samoa had an outbreak there that they're not sure where that started from either, and that killed off like 22% of their population. For a small island in the South Pacific, that's quite a lot.
It really is. So they started to look at how was this disease getting around. And they started thinking a little bit about the sanitation issues that we have. Now, one of the things that brought this back to life for me was that the resurgence of it. The government finally tried to tell people, wear masks, be careful, stay away from people. So people did for a short period of time, and then about 4 months later, when everybody thought they were safe, they went back out and the resurgence of the flu started again. So that was the first one. There really wasn't that many others that jumps out at you until we get into the polio epidemic, which you can talk about, of early 1950s.
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things I would like to say about the Spanish flu as well. It was the sudden increase of mobility with the troops heading from here over to Europe that moved it around the world a lot faster than it might have gone otherwise.
Exactly.
And I
And
was noticing in some of my research from the local papers that it was really getting very hard for them to handle it over here too. They took a lot of very vigorous types of steps, including what today we're calling social distancing. Telling people don't get close to anybody, wear masks, and they were setting up the same things. They had tent hospitals everywhere because there were just so many people getting that flu.
so many people affected.
As a matter of fact, one of them was in Brookline, in a place right now that was just west of Harvard Street, in between Comm Ave and Beacon Street. There's a playground up there now on the top of the hill at Summit Street, I'm sorry. And that was like fairly close to the hospital, so they could get doctors and things up there quickly if they needed them in that time. And we also had some, I'm just looking for some Brockton news that I saw in here to see if I can just give here we are. On September 27th in the Globe, there was an article, the War Department sends doctors to Brockton. So they were having trouble with the staffs that they had here then too, coping with this thing. And the War Department hadn't shipped all the doctors off to Europe yet, and they sent them to Brockton, at least at one point, because there was one spot in the article that says 18 deaths occurred today, and that was in Brockton. And I don't know if we've come up to that level yet with the COVID. And the mayor at the time was Mayor Gleason, who had sent a telegram to Washington asking for help, and they did send it. And it did take, because there were like 3 waves of this epidemic that went through here between 1918 and 1920, and it seemed like, just as they figured they were getting finished with one, that had a little bit of a respite before it started up all over again.
And just think about what we were doing back in 1918. Most of us lived in close proximity to each other. Most of us didn't have cars. A lot of people are still traveling by horse and carriage. They lived in a much closer environment. So a small outbreak like that in a very small area was very serious.
Yeah, and as I recall hearing at the end of all this, even over till now, there was a lot of misinformation that happened at the time that people have not been able to actually figure out how many people actually died, and they're figuring about 3 to 5% of the world population died during that time.
Yeah. I think now when I listen to some of the statistical numbers, whether they are COVID deaths or whether they are people that have underlying disease processes that ended up with a pneumonia on top of the COVID that finally either put their heart or their lungs in such stress that they couldn't make it.
Yeah,
so I don't know.
There was another big difference too between the two. It seemed to the flu back then seemed to hit mostly very healthy men between the ages of 20 and 40.
Yes, and this particular one struck very, very quickly. And they're saying they got up in the morning and were ready to go to work, and they were dead by lunchtime. So it was a very, very insidious onset, which is very scary to think.
Yeah. And there was a lot of fear that ran through all this too. So there were statewide calls to stop all kinds of gatherings. So there were restrictions put on every kind of meeting. any kind of place, schools, theaters, churches, and it was like a statewide thing.
And we
And
didn't
it
have
was,
the internet back there. We didn't have the phone service that we have. We didn't have the TV. We didn't have the internet. There were just so many things. So they relied on word of mouth. They relied on the newspapers to get the news out there.
yeah, and the fastest, that was actually the fastest way to get the news out was through the newspapers, because they would put out 5, 6 editions a day
Yeah.
normally anyway.
I remember that.
And radio was just getting started at that point, so that hadn't even become a well saturated medium at that point, because you couldn't get really any news. Most of what you could get on radio at that time was timing signals and a few other things like that. So it was just a communications nightmare for a lot of the local folks too.
So with all of the people that we've heard complaining about this COVID, social distancing, and stay home, can you imagine staying home without all of the advantages that we have at this point?
There's certainly a lot more ways to keep yourself amused while you're staying home now, that's for sure.
Absolutely. Do you want to move on to the polio epidemic?
Okay, I can remember that because I actually was part of that, although it was way at the very end of it all. It seemed like the 1955 year in New England was worse than it was anywhere else. And the following year, there was a much smaller outbreak in 56, but the rest of the country was having a much greater effect in 56, and it was spreading crazily then in the rest of the country. In 55, there were lines of people outside the hospitals waiting to get sick children in there.
Yeah.
And it was very interesting because over the years they had determined that what caused polio to spread was spread through fecal bacteria, through fecal matter.
Exactly.
And that's why they closed down beaches and things like that, because they didn't know where it was coming from, and that was where most people were congregating. But if you remember right, back in those days, most sewer systems emptied out into the oceans, and they weren't necessarily that far from the beaches where people were spending hot summer days.
And again, we didn't have the sanitation that we have today. And the weather would get hot and the young kids would go out and play in the streets with all their friends. They'd have water showers coming out of the faucets and out of hoses. And it happened for a couple of years in a row. We had outbreaks in the springtime. Young kids, like 5 to 9 years old, were the most susceptible.
And they
Do
were
you
also
remember how old you were when it first hit?
Well, there were several. It happened fairly frequently from the 1930s through 1956, and some of the guidelines that they had out then and things that people were doing was you wouldn't send kids outside their own neighborhood, because everybody figured they were in their neighborhood, they were all used to each other, so they weren't going to pass it back and forth.
Yep.
And it was also something that seems to have been discovered later, that it was the increase in sanitation which seemed to cause these outbreaks. Because when the younger a child is when they get the polio, the more likely they are to survive it with no paralysis or any other problems.
Right.
And it was through the work of Albert Sabin and Jonas Salk that we actually got the vaccines that were used back at the end of those epidemics.
And those didn't come easily. Those came from some hard work. I was very surprised, as we're seeing now with the COVID, there were a lot of people that decided, we can come up with a quick fix here. So some of the quick fixes were poultices that they would apply to the extremity. They were baths. People were drinking quinine. They were drinking radium water, gold. They were doing hydrotherapy, electrotherapy, and they were doing oxygen by positive electricity through the lower extremities. Now, I can't even figure out whether they were applying electricity directly to the leg or what. But to think that that was something that they tried.
Well,
So then Sabin and Salk came along and they said, well, how are these people getting it? Are some people building up antibodies? And if they are, how can we harness it and give it to the population in a manner that they don't get polio, or they get a very, very mild case and can build up their own immunity?
Yeah, the idea of using the actual bacteria itself to produce a vaccine was something that probably happened for the first time when they developed the smallpox vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Because they used a live smallpox virus to create the vaccine.
Yes. And don't forget, you mentioned it, you said bacteria. It is not a bacteria.
My mea culpa.
It is a virus. Difference being that a bacteria can be killed by antibiotics. A virus you can only treat symptomatically and care for the symptoms that you're seeing. So these people that discovered this, I mean, we didn't even have the ability. A virus is much smaller than bacteria. We did not even have microscopes that were good enough at that time to visualize the virus. So they were treating something that they couldn't even really see.
Yeah, there are some photos from the microscopes they had at the time, and it's just a little teeny speck that you see. Yes. And trying to figure out what was actually going to destroy that virus would have taken a lot of work.
Yeah, it would have. But as we also spoke the other day, if you look back at hieroglyphics from ancient Egypt, we remember seeing pictures on walls of the pharaohs, some that had withered limbs, very reminiscent of the polio outbreak. So it's not a brand new disease that popped out in the 1950s. It was something that has existed in our population for many years.
Yeah, that's one of the reasons why they figure that it was the sanitation, the increase in sanitation that had something to do with those outbreaks, because children, when they were very, very small, would only get a mild case of it, and that was the end of it.
Right, and because you had your mother's natural immunity.
Plus, you're playing out in the dirt all the time anyway. So.
Yeah, exactly. I think some of the stuff that I didn't know, I'm going to give a plug for my old employer, Children's Hospital Medical Center in Boston. In the 1930s, they had started to do the research. And they cultivated the virus in human tissue, which was the first step in actually being able to relay the antibodies to other people. And then they finally got it tested in 1954, and it wasn't until 8 years later that the oral polio vaccine was actually started to be used. And many of us got it in the school systems. They just
Yeah,
lined you up and
as a victim of the polio, I had developed the antibodies from when I had it, and they still made me take it too.
absolutely,
They didn't want to take any
absolutely.
chances.
Exactly, exactly. Um, as we talked about, there were two different kinds. A lot of people remember the withered limbs, but then the other people remember the old iron lungs. So this is long before they had ventilators that the hospitals are using now. The iron lung was a sealed pressure chamber that by using negative and positive pressure, it would inflate and deflate the chest. And
Yeah.
not everybody had those. You went along fine, you had some weakness in your limbs.
The hospital I was in was the floating hospital. And I remember seeing those even out in the hallways because they didn't have enough space for them to keep them all in one room. And there are some photos that I have seen which rooms full of people in iron lungs. And it was the thing that saved them because as they got over the disease, keeping those chest muscles operating all that time helped build them back
Exactly,
up again.
exactly. So now they've learned that in order to survive the polio virus, they need to maintain high immunity against polio in the population, and that's through vaccination. And I know a lot of people feel very strongly pro and against vaccinations. But I need to say that we need to think about it, because there are things out there that can get us and can cause lifelong issues.
Yes, and we have a few more of those that we can talk about as well. What did you want to move on to
Absolutely.
next? The tuberculosis, because there's a little segue I can use there. Tuberculosis was a disease of the lungs. It's amazing how many of these things involve the lungs, isn't it?
It is. It is. Our lung tissue is very susceptible to the viruses. And many times now the TB virus would actually get into the lungs and cause the lung tissue to dissolve on itself. Many times with some of these others, what happens with them is that it opens the lungs to subsequent infections. So if you get the COVID-19 virus, it attaches to lung tissue and makes it weaker and gives you more difficulty. So if you now have asthma, COPD, lung problems to begin with, you add this on top of it, and it sets you up for not moving the secretions that you need to move to keep your lungs operating properly.
Yeah, what I was going to say was one of the things that they decided was a major factor in the spread of tuberculosis was sanitation.
Again,
So they clean up things, and people start to get sick from polio at later stages in their life than they used to before. So it's just an interesting little piece of information that sometimes the dirt isn't as bad as we like to think.
exactly. It was interesting. I did watch American Experience put out by PBS. It's called the American Plague. And it's talking about that TB killed 1 out of 7 people alive at that time. And people would do okay, and they would be seen by their doctor, and the doctor would say, go out and get into the fresh air, go out and get into the sunshine. So people that could afford it left from inner cities and went out west, went south, went out to as far as California. There was an ad at the time, go west and be cured. get into the fresh air. There was another belief at that time that it was genetic. So the people that were developing it were also getting stigmatized. You didn't want to go play with that family because they have TB. But the people that went west and relaxed would start to improve their health.
Yeah, it's like the most popular places were out the high desert and the high plains in the Southwest. And the air was much cleaner out there than it was in any of the cities. So that was probably a good place to go.
Yes, exactly. And that is why even to this day, if you look at a lot of the hospitals in areas, the hospitals are set up high. And because a lot of them were TB sanatoriums at the time, and they felt if you got them up, you got them out, they would get healthier.
Yeah. And one of the foremost people who was working on a vaccine at that time was the man who started up the Saranac Lake in upstate New York, the Saranac Lake Sanatorium, which has since become a very popular vacation
resort
area.
Yes. So it's been great when you think about that. Florida, one of the gentlemen that I read about headed out to Colorado, another one to Santa Barbara, California. They really did move about. But I remember my mother telling me that she was in a TB sanatorium for a portion of her younger life. And it was very sad because she was there and she was not allowed to have family visitors. It was a very scary place for kids.
I had a cousin too that was in one. I lived, as a matter of fact, it was during the time I had polio. I was living up in Braintree Highlands, which is right near the Norfolk County Hospital, which was a TB sanitarium. And I had a cousin that was there. And in order to visit her, we had to go stand on the grounds outside her window and wave up at her on the 4th floor.
Like the people are doing now for their families in nursing homes. And yeah, so, we have gone through this before, except for now we have so much more information.
Yeah. Tell me, do you remember the tuberculosis tests we used to get in school as kids?
My goodness, I still got them, I think once or twice a year while I was still working as a nurse. It was intradermal, which was introduced under the skin.
On the forearm.
On the forearm, and it was a little round. It looked like a pimple when it was first done.
And it itched like the dickens, as I remember.
Oh my goodness, it burned something horrible. And you came out positive if in 72 hours it was red and still raised. And if you had no result at all, you were negative and off you went.
Yeah.
Of course, now, if you test positive for TB, they'll do an X-ray, and then they'll start you on the medications for it. So again, they have found out what causes it and what can we do to prevent it.
Now, there is one other little interesting nugget that comes to mind here. With the mortality rate, actually one out of 7 people that had it would die. There was never any major epidemic of tuberculosis that has been recorded that I know of.
No, again, I wonder what their record keeping was.
Yeah.
They certainly didn't have the ability to do the record keeping that we do now. Again, no internet, word of mouth, there wasn't CDC available, there wasn't World Health Organization. So things have changed, hopefully for the better, but we are still dealing with another virus.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the SARS outbreak in, what was it, back in 2003?
Absolutely.
Because this COVID is a SARS type of virus.
It is. And interesting enough, on the SARS, it is considered a COVID virus. It started out in animals and it mutated and made the jump over to human beings. It, bats were the initial group. So everybody, these poor little bats were getting a bad rap. Bats were the initial group that were the hosts. They grew the virus mutated within them, and then it made the jump over to human beings. Both the SARS and the COVID that we are having trouble with now, both come from the same RNA, but they are not the same from the point of view that once the virus mutated from the bat to the human being, that was a totally different type of virus. The COVID virus that was in the bats now have again mutated to a totally different type of virus, same basic RNA, but with one little tiny difference. And that little tiny difference is the difference between having a vaccine for SARS and a vaccine for what we are now seeing. Basically, the vaccine that they found for SARS enables it to neutralize the protein that allows the virus to attach to the cells and therefore cause the disease. So they found what they needed in that particular instance. But these abilities to find the vaccines don't happen overnight. It takes a long time for them to actually find that little tiny spot on the RNA chain that has made the mutation that allows it to jump into our bodies and attach to our lung tissue. So hopefully, but I'm not saying shortly, like some of our government people are. I'm saying we're going to have some ups and downs, and it's not going to happen quick. It's going to be a slow reintroduction into society from where we are now.
Okay, well, I see our time is pretty much up. Is there anything you wanted to say in closing here, Marie?
I guess one of the big things was, for me, the first couple of days of this were a horrible overload of news. And as our president talks about fake news, I was getting a lot of that. And I finally decided that I was going to narrow myself down. So now I watch one news show a day. And when I want to know more about it, I go to the websites for the World Health Organization and the CDC. And those are the people I believe, because those are the places that are actively working on it, and they're telling the truth. They don't have a bias, they don't have another point of view. So watch your news, listen, be aware, but don't believe everything you hear.
Okay, thank you so much, Marie. It was a wonderful time having this chat with you. And I just want to let you viewers out there know this is the first history program that we will be producing. We have a whole bunch of others that are planned with the rest of the Historic Commission. And as soon as we can get out and start shooting, we have some interesting things that we will be putting together for you all.
We do. We have some interesting pieces ahead.
Okay.
This has given me a great opportunity to surf the internet and see what's out there.
Okay, thank you so much, Marie. And we'll be looking forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you.
All right, Paul, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.